All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. It is an incredible zechus, Baruch Hashem, to be able to learn the daf with all of you today. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person, but at least Baruch Hashem, it is a great zechus to be with you virtually. Thank all of those who sponsored this morning's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Josh and Becca Friedman, for dedicating all the Shiurim and drushos this month in relation of the yahrzeit of Josh's father, Yisroel Yehuda and HaRav Chaim Rephael, as well as for the aliyah and Neshamas of all of those who were murdered al Kiddush Hashem on Simchas Torah, and for a safe return of all of our chayalim and hostages, and a complete refuah for all of those who have been injured. Shmuel Silber and Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents, Hinda bas Henech Ephraim, Yitzchok Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, and Sarah Rachel bas Baruch Avram. The Pepper family, in memory of their brother and uncle Yosef Pepper, Yosef David ben Yaakov Zichron Livracha, and an anonymous, and of course as a shir we dedicate all of Maseches Bava Kamma Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Eliyahu Harush, who died al Kiddush Hashem, defending the holy Jews of Sderot, and a week of learning anonymous sponsor in honor of Menachem Schoenfeld's birthday. Incredible. Simchas, brachas, hatzlocha, meh be'esim shanim tovos. Shabbat says, so today's daf, and a lichte Chanukah, of course, to everyone. So today's daf is Lametes 39, and we are picking up in Mirat Hashem at the Mishnah on Lametes 39a. And the Mishnah says as follows: Shor shal pikeach shenagach shor shal cherish. Interesting case. You have a shor that belongs to a pikeach. Remember again, a pikeach is a person who's totally mentally competent. Pikeach are a regular, normal person. So the shor of a pikeach goes ahead and gores the shor of a cheresh, shota, and katan. So remember again, these are people who lack capacity. So what's the halacha? Chayiv. Ultimately, again, one is chayiv. So the pikeach, the competent person who went ahead and his animal gored the shore of the cheresh shota v'katan, he is chayiv. Conversely, v'shal cheresh shota v'katan shenagach shor shal pikeach pater. On the other hand, halacha l'maisa, if the shor of a cheresh shota or katan goes ahead and gores the shor of the pikeach, then ultimately, again, the cheresh shota v'katan will be pater. Now, again, no surprises here, because halacha l'maisa, again, we have to safeguard the property of the cheresh shota v'katan, and therefore, again, if a pikeach goes ahead and injures them, there has to be liability. But on the flip side, halacha l'maisa, if the cheresh shota or katan do something, since they lack capacity, therefore there's no liability. Okay, shor shel cheresh shota v'katan shenagach beisin ma'amidan lahen apotropos. Now, here's what's interesting. So, on one hand, the Mishnah tells me that if the shor of a cheresh shota v'katan does damage, Beis Din does not hold them liable, which makes perfect sense. There can't be liability for a cheresh shota v'katan because they lack capacity. On the other hand, you can't have a situation where you have a damaging ox and that damage goes unchecked. That poses a problem for the general public. So the Mishnah offers a very interesting solution. The Mishnah says what we do is we appoint an apotropos. An apotropos is like a custodian or a guardian for the property of the cheresh shota v'katan. And we go ahead and we give testimony. We give testimony in front of the apotropos. So what this sounds like, Rashi points out over here, what this sounds like is, so therefore, if the shor of the cheresh shota v'katan does damage, we appoint an apotropos. Testimony is given in the presence of the apotropos, and then again, payment is exacted for the damages. Now, who's paying? Is the apotropos paying? Right? Are the Yisomim, or not the Yisomim, or is the cheresh shota v'katan paying? So that we'll see in the Mishnah, that we'll see in the Gemara. So for two cases. Case number one, a pikeach does damage to the shor of a cheresh shota v'katan, there's liability. Shor of a cheresh shota v'katan that does damage to a pikeach, a regular competent person, pater. Right? Because again, there's no liability for a cheresh shota v'katan. That being said, if a cheresh shota or katan has a damaging ox, so Beis Din will appoint an apotropos, will appoint a custodian, and ultimately, again, the custodian will go ahead and bear the responsibility for the damages of the ox of the cheresh shota v'katan. Again, the mechanics of that we'll have to see in the Gemara. Next. Nispakach ha'cheresh nishtafa ha'shota v'higdila katan. So this is incredible. It's incredible. So remember again, what happens if, let's say again, these individuals, so you have a cheresh shota v'katan. So let's say again, the cheresh, now normally when we speak about a cheresh is deaf mute. So let's say the cheresh regains the ability to hear and to speak. Or nishtafa hashota, the shota, the person who's insane, regains his sanity, vehigdila katan, and the katan becomes an adult. So the Mishnah says, Chazur letamus divrei meir. This is fascinating. So let's say, for example, again, you have this situation of the shar that belongs to a cheresh, a shota, or a katan. Let's say even again, this shar became a habitual offender, so now it's a muad. It's a muad. Now what happens? There's a change in status for the cheresh, shota, the katan. The cheresh, again, is able to hear and able to speak. The shota is sane. The katan grows up. He becomes a gadol. So ultimately, Rabbi Meir holds that the status of the shar is now reset. So in other words, the status that the shar acquired while its owner was a cheresh, shota, v'katan, now that the owner's status changed, so ultimately the shar's status changes as well, and the shar reverts back to being a tam. Rabbi Yossi says, Hareiz hu b'cheskas. Rabbi Yossi says, not true. Not true. Once a shar is a muad, its status doesn't change, even if the status of the owner himself changes. A really incredible idea. That the lashon over here of vehigdila katan. The katan becomes an adult. We say by bris mila, zeha katan gadol yihia. This young child, right? This katan, this small one, should become big. So very beautifully, Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh says. He says, what's the pshat? Actually, Rabbi Soloveitchik also has the same idea as well. Famous word. It's a strange statement. Zeh katan gadol yihia. This one who's little will become great. So what's the pshat? Isn't that obvious? Right now the baby's a baby. Obviously he's going to become bigger in Yirtzeh Hashem. So it's explained that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, he created two luminaries. There's the Ma'ar HaGadol, the large luminary, that's the sun. And Ma'ar HaKaton, that's the moon, small luminary. Now why is that? Because remember again, the moon doesn't generate its own light. The moon reflects the light of the sun. So what do we say to a young child? We say, Zeh Katan. A child, when he's young, doesn't really create his own light. A child reflects the light of his parents, reflects the light of his family, reflects the light of his community. Whatever light is around him, that's the light that he's able to reflect. What's the bracha that we give to our children when they're young? Right now, you're a katan, and it's good. Hopefully, I'm giving you enough light that you could reflect my light that I'm giving you. But my goal, my desire, my aspiration for you, zeh katan, gadol yihia. Don't spend your life being a moon, just reflecting the light of others. But rather find the courage to become a sun, S-U-N. Find the courage ultimately again to become the great luminary. Become someone in life who generates and creates your own light. Beautiful Yisod. Again, it's the lashon over here. So v'higdil hakatan. The katan becomes a gadol. So again, it's not just something in Bava Kamma, but it's an aspiration that we all have for ourselves and Amir Hashem for our children in life as well. Weiter, shar ha'etstadin enu chayiv misa. So this is actually an interesting case. Shar ha'etstadin means like a shar, an ox that is trained for fighting, like a bullfighting ox, like a sparring ox. Right? So I guess people had ox fighting. So you would train an ox to fight. So ultimately, again, if that ox ends up killing someone, it's not chayiv misa. Why? Shene'emar ki igach v'lo shigechu. Because when the Torah speaks about liability for an ox that kills someone, it uses the lashon of ki igach. Ki igach means if the ox gores, as opposed to an ox that is trained to gore. Just an interesting distinction over here. Okay, we'll come back to that case, Abi, as well. So let's analyze. Says the Gemara, Hagufa Kasha. So remember again, first part of the Mishnah said that if you have a shar of a cheresh, shota, or a katan, a shor of a cheresh, shota, and katan, that went ahead and gored the shor of a bikeach, that ultimately there's no liability. Why? Alma in ma'amidin apotropis. Litam ligbos migufo. So remember again, the fact that there's no liability indicates that there's no liability. We're not setting up apotropis, right? We're not setting up a custodian. We're not putting someone in charge of the cheresh, shota, of a katan or their property. So therefore, there's no liability. That's from the Reisha. Ema seifa shor shel cheresh, shota, v'katan shenagach bezin ma'amidin lahen apotropis u'meidin lahen b'fnei apotropis. Ama meidin lahem apotropis latam ligbos migufo. Yet look at the end of the Sefer, right? End of the Mishnah. What did the end of the Mishnah say? So remember, the end of the Mishnah said, but if a cheresh, shota, of a katan has an ox that is goring, we set up an apotropis, we give testimony in the presence of the apotropis, and there's liability, which sounds like there's even liability for tam, even for a first-time offense. So how do you reconcile the first statement of the Mishnah and the latter statement of the Mishnah? Amar Rava, hachi katani, this is what it means to say. V'im hochseku nagchonin ma'amidin lahen apotropis u'me'idin lahen bifnei apotropis u'meshavin lahen muad dechi hadar v'nagach l'shalem ma'aliyah. So this is actually very interesting. So the Gemara wants to suggest the following. Rava wants to suggest that the truth is we don't immediately set up an apotropis. So rather, here's the way it happens. Right, you have a cheres shota or katan, which have a shor. The shor gores the first time, the second time, and now the third time. So for the first three times, we'll call it first three times, there's no liability because it's an animal that belongs to a cheres shota of a katan, and these are people who are not vested with halachic responsibility, and therefore if their shor does damage, they're simply not responsible. However, once we're already up to goring number 3, which means now this shor has become a muad, at that point, Beis Din now gets involved, goes ahead and appoints an apotropis. We go ahead and we make this animal a formal muad. Remember, again, to become a muad, you need a Beis Din. So now we make this animal a formal muad, and halacha l'maisa, at this point, now there is liability. At this point, ultimately, if the animal gores again, there will be complete liability min aliyah. Remember, again, a muad pays nezek shalim, complete damages, min aliyah, from the best property. So that's what Rava is suggesting. So therefore, again, the Mishnah is not contradicting each other. When the Mishnah says in the beginning that if the shor of a cheresh shota or if the shor of a cheresh shota of a katan gores the shor of a pikeach, that there's no liability, that's talking about the animal is a tam. The animal is a tam, there's no liability, there's no Beis Din not getting involved in this. Once the animal is already gored 3 times, then again we appoint an apotropis, we make it a formal muad, and therefore if it gores again, you're going to have to pay nezek shalim min aliyah, complete damages from the best property, which then of course yields the next question, me aliyas man, whose best property? In other words, who's paying for this? So now our animal has become a muad. Now remember, the title of the, so to speak, the animal is owned by a cheres shot of a cotton. So now you've introduced an apotropis, so who has to pay? So now the animal gores a 4th time. So now it's a muad animal, right? The shar of the cheres shot or cotton is a muad animal, gores a 4th time. It is now chayiv nezek shalim min aliyah. Who pays? So says the Gemara, me aliyas man, Rabbi Yochanan says, me aliyas yisomim. Pays from the best property of the Yisomim. Again, after all, the shar belongs to the Yisomim, right? Now again, he's using the lashon over here of Yisomim, but remember again, the idea over here is you pay from the property of he who owns the shar. So the cheres shot of the cotton, Yisomim, whoever it is. Rabbi Yossi Amar me aliyas apotropis. Rabbi Yossi Chanina says no, not true, but rather again we pay from the apotropis has to pay. Interesting, the apotropis has to pay. Now, interestingly enough, we are going to see that even if you make the apotropis pay, the apotropis has the ability to settle up later on with the estate of the cheres shota v'katan or yisomim for that matter. So now this is interesting. So Rabbi Yochanan holds. So let's go back. Rabbi Yochanan holds that halacha l'maisa, after the animal becomes a muad, if it gores a 4th time, so now you have to pay min aliyah, pay nezek shalim, complete damages min aliyah. And Rabbi Yochanan says we take that from the property of the cheresh shota katan, or for example, yisomim. So the Gemara says, "Mir Rabbi Yochanan." Rabbi Yochanan really say this. V'ha'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Basi, ein niskakin lenichse yisomim ela imkin ribas ochelas bain. In general, the halacha is that. In general, the halacha is that we don't normally, we've seen this many times before, we don't touch the property of Yisomim. We generally just don't go ahead and touch that at all. That's the general rule, right? Because since we're careful with the property of Yisomim, we leave it alone. With one exception, Rabbi Yochanan, with one exception, so the Gemara says, Ela imkin ribas ochelas bain. Let's say the father owes a debt, and the debt is accruing interest. So then we have a vested interest in settling that debt so that the interest doesn't continue to accrue and cause an ongoing loss for the Yisomim. But that's the only kind of situation where we would intervene. Similar idea would be, let's say again, the father dies, he leaves behind the wife is consuming mizonos, food. So remember again, a woman gets mizonos up until she gets her ksuva paid out. So if she decides that she wants her ksuva, we'll pay that out. Why? Because that's in the best interest of the estate of the Yisomim as well, because once the ksuva is paid, then there's no longer any mizonos obligation. To which the Gemara says, so I will say, so the point there is, what do you see? You see that Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that in general, we do not touch the estate of Yisomim. And what the Gemara is doing over here is we're assuming that whatever is true for Yisomim is going to be true for a cheresh, shota, v'katan. These are all people that the halacha protects. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says is we don't touch the property of Yisomim unless, of course, there's a loss. So again, if there's a debt that's accruing interest, or again, the wife wants to get paid out her ksuba, because if she doesn't get paid out her ksuba, she's continuing to draw mizonos. So those are situations where we'll intervene, but otherwise, we're just going to leave it alone. We're not going to touch. So how could Rabbi Yochanan say over here that in this case, when the animal became a muad, we're going to pay nezek sheleima from the estate of the Yisomim, or from the cheresh shota the cotton? To which the Gemara says, you're right, epoch, change it around. Rabbi Yochanan arme aliyah apotropsin, Rabbi Yossi v'chanina arme aliyah yisomim. So Gemara says, you're right, just change the attribution. Rabbi Yochanan is the one who said, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't say you should collect ultimately again from Yisomim, rather he says you should collect from the apotropis. And Rabbi Yossi v'chanina is the one who says that you could collect from the Yisomim. To which the Gemara says, come on, Amar Rava, Mishum Dekashi di Rabbi Yochanan, Maseches Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina TORAH. So look what you just did. So because you had a contradiction in the positions of Rabbi Yochanan, so you make Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina the more difficult position. How does that help you? So in the effort to resolve a contradiction, you've just simply put Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina in the untenable situation, or in the illogical situation of saying that you're going to touch the estate of Yisomim. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina dainahu. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina was a well-established, a reputable judge at Dayim. V'nochis lo'umka dedina. And he always descended into the depths of the law. In other words, Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina was someone who, again, lived his life. He was a dayan, he was a judge. So this was very much within the purview of his day-to-day activities. So it doesn't make sense. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina would say that halacha l'maisa, you have to go ahead and pay from the yisum. That doesn't make any sense. Rather, elali olam lo tevoch. So you're right. You know what? Leave it. Don't reverse the positions. So rather, it was Rabbi Yochanan who says that when the shah becomes a muad, you actually pay from the best property of the yisumim. But one second, how do you reconcile that though? Because Rabbi Yochanan also said that in general, we don't touch the estate of yisumim unless, of course, there's an active drain. So whether it's a debt that's accruing interest, or a woman who is a wife who's taking mizonos, otherwise, so how does so that's what Rabbi Yochanan says. So then why would he say over here that if the animal becomes a muad, you pay nezek sheleima? To which the Gemara says, mazik shiny. This case is different. Why is this case different? Because here, this is a case of damages. And maybe when it comes to damages, Rabbi Yochanan says, you know what? We do take from the property of the Yisomim. We do. Damages are different. Normally we won't, right? In satisfaction of a debt, we may not touch the property of the Yisomim, but ultimately, again, to satisfy damages, we absolutely will. We absolutely will. Pretty incredible. So the Gemara goes back to Rabbi Yochanan, Amar me aliyas yosomim. So Rabbi Yochanan says, ultimately again, it has to be now, again, so that's Rabbi Yochanan's logic. So now we've resolved the contradiction. So now we're still left with, so let's follow the progression. Progression is, if a cheresh, shota, or katan has a shor, and that shor does damage. Shor does damage the first time, the second time, the third time, while it's still a tam, Beis Din doesn't get involved. Once it's damaged 3 times, Beis Din goes ahead and appoints an apotropis, a custodian or a guardian for this shor, or really for the cheresh, shota, the katan, for the property, and they make the animal a muad. At that point, if the animal gores again, it's now a muad, pays nezek sheleima, complete damages, min aliyah, from the best property. Now the machlokas is, who's the best property? Who's best property? Rabbi Yochanan, best property of the Yisomim. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, best property of the apotropis. That's still our machlokas. So here we go. Rabbi Yochanan, or me'aliyas Yisomim, Rabbi Yochanan says from the best property of the Yisomim. Why? Di amrit me'aliyas apotropis. Because if halacha l'maisa you say that it has to be the apotropis who has to pay, if that's really what you're going to say, we'll say Amud Beis, Lamed Tesima Beis 39b, Memani velo avdi. We'll say, listen to this for just a second. If you say that it's the apotropis who has to pay, and he has to pay from the best of his property, then what? Who's going to take that job? Who in their right mind is going to take that job? So now I have to worry about the ox, and not only that, if this liability comes from my pocket. So if Rabbi Yochanan says, if you want someone to be an apotropis, the burden of payment has to be on Yisomim. Rabbi Yosef Chanina Amar me'aliyas apotropis. Rabbi Yosef Chanina says, no, that's not true. You could cause the apotropis to pay. Why? The cholzim v'nifraim b'nei asum l'chi gadli. Rabbi Yosef Chanina says, again, let's be clear. So again, you have Rabbi Yochanan saying it has to come from the property of the Yisomim, because otherwise no one is ever going to want to take this job. Rabbi Yosef Chanina says, that's not true. You could ask the apotropis to pay. Why? The apotropis is going to get paid back. We know he's going to get paid back, right? When is he going to get paid back? He'll get paid back from the Yisomim, from the Cherei Shot of a Katan. When there is an opportunity for him to reclaim payment, he'll go, in other words, all we're asking for him to do is to lay out the money. That's what we're asking him to lay out the money. But Lamaisa, he has the ability to recapture those expended funds through the property of the Cherei Shot of a Katan, through the Yisomim. Incredible. The Gemara says, Litam ligbos migufo tanahi. Now I will say, so up until now, what we've been focusing on, and by the way, the way we paskin, we'll leave the Rambam for later on. The way the Gemara is understanding over here right now, up until this point, is that Allah Alamaisa, the only time the apotropis gets brought in is when the animal becomes a muad. While the animal is a tam, we're not appointing an apotropis, and therefore, again, there is no liability for damage done by an ox of a cherei shot of a cotton. Now the Gemara says that's a machlokas. The reality is this idea of whether or not we appoint an apotropis before the animal becomes a muad, while it's a tam, for the shore of a cherei shot of a cotton, this is a machlokas tanoim. Here we go. The sanyo, because we learned the sanyo. Shar shenis charshu bailov. So if you have a shar and the owner of the shar became a cheresh, or finished nishtatu bailov, or the owner of the shar went insane, or shahalchu bailov l'medina sayam, or again the owner is just not present, the owner is not around. What's talacha? Yehuda ben Nekusa Amar Sumchos. Yehuda ben Nekusa Amar Sumchos. Hareyu bitamuso ad shi'idu bo bifnei bailin. So Yehuda ben Nekusa says the name of Sumchos, that ultimately, again, the animal remains a tam. In other words, what's happening over here is as follows. Yehuda ben Nekusa is saying the name of Sumchos. The only way for an animal to change status is if you do this status change in the presence of the owner. But if the owner is not there, either geographically he's not there, he's overseas, or cognitively he's not there, he's a cheresh, a shota, or a katan, you can't change the status of that animal. The Chacham say, no, not true. So we'll say, Chacham say, not true. Not true. You could go ahead and change the status of an animal, even not in the presence of the owner. How could that happen? You appoint an apotropis. So we'll say, so essentially the apotropis becomes kind of like the stand-in owner. That's really what's happening. He becomes a stand-in owner for the animal. You could change the status like that. So we'll say, a fascinating machlokas. So in other words, can you change the status of the shar not in the presence of its, or let me say it differently. Do you need the presence of the owner in order to change the actual status of the shar? So ultimately, Yehuda ben Nekusa, name of Sumcha, says yes, and therefore if the actual owner is not present, you cannot change the status of the shar. Chacham say not true. You need an owner, but you could have a stand-in owner, an apotropis, and in the presence of the apotropis, you could go ahead and change the status. Now, that's machlokes 1. Now it gets exciting. Watch this. So the Gemara says, Nispaka chacherish nishtapa shota behigdila katan uba'u bailav memedina sayam. So we'll say, so now what happens? Imagine for a moment, let's play this out. So now the owner returns from overseas. The katan grows up. Right? The shota becomes sane. The cheresh now could speak and hear. So what's the halacha? Yehuda ben Nekusa mesumchos chazra l'tamuso ad shi'idu bo bifnei bailim. So Yehuda ben Nekusa says that lamaisa, the animal is still a tam. Now the truth is, it's not a chiddush because Yehuda ben Nekusa says the animal never changed its status. So the animal is, so even though the owner changed status now, the animal is still a tam. Only way to change the status of the animal is to give testimony in front of the actual owner. Rabbi Yossi Amar Harehu b'cheskaso. Incredible. Rabbi Yossi says no, the animal remains in its chazak. In other words, that if in the presence of the apotropis, the animal became a muad, right? Then ultimately, again, that status remains with the animal even when the owner's status or state, so to speak, changes. Amru, so the Gemara says, Amru, Mahu bitamusa. Ma'u bitamusa the Kamma Sumchus. Shabbos say, so what does it mean when Sumchus says, so it's interesting, when Sumchus says that halacha l'maisa, if the owner returns from overseas, the katan grows up, the cheresh could speak in here, the shota becomes sane, so the lashon is chazar litamuso. Ultimately, the animal returns to its tam state. So what does that mean? My, so the Gemara says, Amru, my harihu bitamusa the Kamma Sumchus, ilema, like klal. See if we're talking about a case where ultimately, again, while the owner was physically or cognitively absent, there was, right, no one testified about this shar. The fact that Sumcha says that when the owner is once again present, cognitively, geographically, that the animal returns to its tam status, that indicates that something happened with this animal. That somebody made it a muad. So the Gemara says, Ela mai hari b'tamuso. Rather, what does it mean when it says b'tamuso? Harehu bitimimuso delo mechasrin alei. Rather, what it means is that halacha l'maisa, it is complete. Bitamuso doesn't mean tam. Rather, bitamuso means bitmimuso. It is complete. Delo mechasrin alei. We do not make it deficient. Now, what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Rashi's in the short lines over here, about 5 lines in. Hari bitmimuso delo gavi negichos tamos mine de'in ma'amidin apetropos letam ligvos migufo. So we'll say what it must mean is as follows. What it must mean is that halacha l'maisa, according to Sumchus, when the owner was either physically or cognitively absent, we don't testify about that animal. In other words, there is no apotropos involved for a tam, and therefore, again, there's no collections for tam damages. Remember, tam damages, for a tam, you pay chatzi nezek, and that chatzi nezek comes from the value of the body of the animal itself. So when Sumcha says that ultimately, again, when the owner returns physically or cognitively, that we return the animal bitimimuso in its completeness, means that when the animal was a tam, we were not collecting any damages. Alma, what do you see from here according to Sumchus? Ein ma'amidin apetropis lahem ligbos migufo. You see from here that ultimately, again, according to Yehuda ben Kusa and Sumchus, that halacha l'maisa, we don't appoint an apotropos for a tam animal of a cheresh shot of a cotton. We don't do it. And again, that's like what we were saying before, that the apotropos is really only introduced once the animal becomes a muad. But when the animal is a tam, we are not introducing any apotropos. The Chum say, ma'amidan lahen apotropos. Chum disagree. The Chum say, no. We do establish an apotropos, ume'idin lahen bifnei apotropos. Now, the Chachamim seem to say that halacha l'maisa, we do introduce an apotropos, ultimately again for the tam animal, and ultimately again we go ahead and we will testify in front of the apotropos even regarding tam chatzi nezek damages. Alma mi'idin apotropos l'tam ligbos migufo. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That we do in fact go ahead and set up an apotropos even for a tam animal, even for chatzi nezek. Seif Rabosai, what's fascinating about this is now we have a machlokes. What we thought before was a davar pashut is now machlokes. So do we introduce an apotropos for tam damages or not? This seems to be a machlokes between Sumchus and the Chachamim. Sumchus saying no, Chachamim saying yes. Incredible. The Seifa b'may kamiflagi. So we'll say, so what are they arguing about in the second part of the Brisa? So this is incredible. Rishus mishana ika benayu. Well, so what they're arguing on the second part of the Brisa is, does a change in Rishus, literally a change in domain, change the status of the animal? In other words, remember again, the second part of the Brisa was where the owner once again is present, either geographically or cognitively. The owner comes back from overseas. The owner is now healed. He's no longer a cheresh. He's no longer a shota. The katan became a gadol. So now we'll say, so now the shaila is, when there is a change in the status of the owner, does that affect a change in the status of the animal as well? That we call this rishus mishana. Does a change in the status of we'll call it really change of ownership, but it's not a change of ownership, but the animal is transferring back from the rishus of the apotropos back to the rishus of the owner, does that change the status of the animal? So Sumcha Savar, rishus Meshana. Sumcha says yes, when there is a change in the owner or a change in the rishus, so to speak, the animal experiences a change as well, and therefore again, when this animal goes back, quote unquote, goes back to its owner, it's like shar amnesty. Shar amnesty, right? It's no longer a muad, but even if it was a muad, but rather again it goes back to becoming a tam. Rabbi Yossi says no, it's not true. Ultimately, again, change in status, so to speak, change in ownership, reverting back to quote unquote the original owner does not change the status of the shar. Whatever status the shar has, that is the status which remains. Incredible. So we'll say, so a lot of machloksim going on over here. So machlokis number one is, do we go ahead and appoint an apotropos for tam? That's a machlokis. Rishus number two is when the animal does go back, so to speak, to its owner's domain, because the owner is once again present physically or cognitively. Does the status of the animal revert back to tam or not? That's a machlokes. And by the way, keep in mind the previous machlokes, which is when you have an apotropos for a muad animal, you have to pay min aliyah from the best property. Are you paying for the best property of the yisomim or the best property ultimately again of the apotropos? So a lot of machlokes going on over here. So let's analyze a bit more. Shar chere shot of a cotton shenagach. So we'll say if you have the shar of a chere shot of a cotton, that gourd, remember gourd a pikeach, gourd the shar of a regular person. So what's talach? Rabbi Yaakov, so the Gemara says Rabbi Yaakov mishalim chatzi nezek. It's interesting over here. So the Gemara says Rabbi Yaakov pays chatzi nezek. So the Gemara says Rabbi Yaakov maya vidite. So we'll say the lashon over here is interesting. It doesn't say Rabbi Yaakov omer mishalim chatzi. It says Rabbi Yaakov pays chatzi nezek. So the Gemara says Rabbi Yaakov. Why is Rabbi Yaakov responsible for the damage of the shar of a cheresh shota of a cotton? What's the pshat? Eliyahu Rabbi Yaakov omer mishalim chatzi nezek. Rabbi Yaakov says the animal has to pay chatzi nezek. So we'll say, so let's analyze this. Remember again. So this is a shar of a cheresh shota of a cotton that gored the shar of a pikeach. Rabbi Yaakov says you have to pay chatzi nezek. So Gemara says Maya skinon. What's going on over here? So ibitam, if we're talking about a tam animal, so pshita. So obviously again, duchuli alma nami chatzi nezek udu mishalim. So if it's a tam, everyone pays chatzi nezek by a tam. Okay, so what's the chiddush? V'i b'muad, and if it's a muad, id da'avdi le'shmira klal lo by le'shelume. Say if it's a muad, then ultimately again the animal, then if it's a muad, then if the owner or if the apotropos, whoever's watching this, right, if they perform the proper shmira, then perhaps there should be no obligation to pay. In other words, if you properly guarded an animal and the animal still did damage, the Gemara is suggesting maybe there's no liability at all. And if they didn't do proper guarding, then kuli nezek by shlume, then you should have to pay nezek shalim. So what's the case over here? So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, the olam b'muad. Really, it's a case of a muad. V'chama askinon. What's the case over here? Da'avdi shmira pechusa, v'lo avdi shmira mu'ula. Where he watched the animal again with an inferior guarding, but didn't provide it with a proper guarding. So what's the pshat? Rabbi Yaakov, Sabbalak Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yaakov holds ultimately again like Rabbi Yehuda. Damar tzad tamus bim koma omedes. So this is interesting. We're going to talk about this more in tomorrow's Daf Yomi Hashem. The concept that for a muad you pay nezek shalim. Right? We know you pay nezek shalim for a muad. So how do you look at that nezek shalim? Is nezek shalim considered to be just like a brand new payment of complete damages, separate and independent from tam? Or maybe no, maybe what nezek shalim is like this. Nezek shalim, by definition, includes the chatzi nezek of a tam, plus an additional 50% payment that you have to pay for nezek shalim. So this is going to be a raging machlokis that we are going to talk about in Yirtzeh Hashem more in tomorrow's daf. So the Gemara is suggesting as follows. So Rava says, what's the case? The case of here is a muad, and ultimately, again, you went ahead and only guarded the animal as shmira pechus, an inferior guarding, and not a proper guarding. And Rabbi Yaakov holds, like Rabbi Yehuda holds, tzad tamus bim koma omedes, that ultimately, again, the 50% of chatzi nezek remains in place. For Sabbalak Rabbi Yehuda da Amar muad sagele b'shmira pechusa. He also holds that a muad only requires an inferior watching. We'll talk about all of these things. For Sabbalak Rabban Adarim ma'amidin apotropos latam ligvos migufo. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff over here. So rather, again, he must be talking about a case of a muad, but he holds that a muad really only requires an inferior watching, which we'll have to discuss what that means. right? And ultimately, again, he also holds that Allah Lamaisa, we appoint an apotropos for a tam, ultimately, again, legabos migufo. So if you put all of this together, that's where the chatzi nezek comes from. Amarle Abaye says, velopli, they're not arguing. Vatanya, but we learn, shor shal cheresh shot the katan shenadach. If you have a shor of a cheresh shot the katan, that gourd, Rabbi Yehuda mechayiv, Rabbi Yaakov Omer chatzi nezek u'd'mashan. Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayiv, and Rabbi Yaakov says you're only chayiv chatzi nezek. So Amar Rabba Bar Ula, Mashechayiv Rabbi Yehuda, Piresh Rabbi Yaakov. Ultimately, again, they're actually not arguing, but rather, again, Rabbi Yaakov is explaining Rabbi Yehuda. When Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayiv, Rabbi Yaakov says, what does Rabbi Yehuda hold that you're chayiv? He holds that you're chayiv only for chatzi nezek. Ola Abaye Amar Pligi, b'may pligi. According to Abaye, who says that they're arguing. So what are they arguing about? Amar Lecha, Hachama Askinon, b'muad v'lo natre klal. We're talking about a case of an animal that's a muad that was not guarded at all. Rabbi Yaakov sarvak Rabbi Yehuda bechado, poligalei bechada. So Rabbi Yaakov holds like Rabbi Yehuda in one case, and they disagrees with him in a different case. Sarvak Rabbi Yehuda bechada, he holds like Rabbi Yehuda in one case. Dealer Rabbi Yehuda sarvat sad tamas when Kamma omedes. So ultimately, again, he holds like Rabbi Yehuda in one case, namely that when it comes to nezek shalim, the way we look at nezek shalim is there's chatzi nezek, and then nezek shalim builds on that, and therefore, even in a case where ultimately, again, you can't create full liability for nezek shalim, the chatzi nezek piece still remains. And ultimately, again, he goes and he argues on him in one case. Rabbi Yehuda savar ma'amidin lahen apetropos latam v'ligbos migufo. He holds, Rabbi Yehuda holds that ultimately, again, we do appoint an apetropos even for tam to go ahead and collect from half damages from the body of the animal itself. Rabbi Yaakov savar ein ma'amidin. And Rabbi Yaakov holds that we do not appoint an apotropos for a tam. Ein ma'amidin v'lo mishalim ela palga demuad. And therefore, the only part she'll have to pay is the half damages, ultimately, again, for muad. So we'll say we'll stop over here for today. So just understand, and I apologize, we went a little bit fast in the last part, but just understand kind of what we're left with over here. So we've introduced a lot of things. So number one, we come up with the idea that in general, halacha l'maisa, there is not liability when the shor of a cheresh shot of a cotton damages someone else, which makes sense, because in general, there's not liability for the actions of a cheresh shot of a cotton. But then what the Mishnah introduces us to is, but one second, you can't have a shor going around and damaging with no liability. So therefore, what did Chazal do? They introduced the apotropos. So now the machlokes is, when does the apotropos get involved? So now we see, there's one school of thought that says, even by a tam, we're going to introduce an apotropos. That's number one, right? So second opinion says, no, not by a tam, only by a muad. Okay, so again, by a tam, if you say you're introducing an apotropos by a tam, so from a payment perspective, is much less complicated. Why? Because remember, tam pays chatzi nezek and migufa from the body of the animal. So therefore, the source of payment is the body of the damaging animal itself. If you hold that you're introducing an apotropos by muad, so that's nezek shalim min aliyah, complete damages in the best property, that becomes a bit more complicated. Why? Because then the shaila is, who's paying that? So that's another machlokes. Ultimately, again, is that from the aliyah of the apotropos, or is that from the aliyah, ultimately, again, of the cheresh shota the katan? So that is another machlokes. So it was like all of this still hangs out there. So we know that there is an apotropos, but we don't know yet when he is introduced, and we don't know for muad payment who is paying the nezek shalim min ha'aliyah. Those are the two pieces that are outstanding. Now the Gemara, by the way, just introduced in this last piece, which again will tie up all these loose ends in Yirtzeh Hashem in tomorrow's daf. But now the Gemara introduces this last piece, which is what level of guarding does a muad ox require? Does it require shmira me'ula, shmira pchusa? That's actually not this sugya. That's introduced later on. Does it require strict guarding, a looser guarding? And then again, one last piece with all of this is, how do we view nezek shalim? Is nezek shalim considered to be chatzi nezek plus an additional 50%? Or no, nezek shalim is a brand new payment. The nafkamina we're going to see, and again, this is what we alluded to over here, the nafkamina we're going to see is in a case where, let's say, there's not going to be liability for nezek shalim. For nezek shalim, can you still hold one responsible ultimately again for the chatzi nezek? In other words, if you can't give complete damages, does the Chatzi Nezek piece throw in? So we'll say, so we're going to stop over here for today. So a lot of, I know it's unsettling feeling finishing off a daf with many like open-ended questions, but at least now you know all of the issues that we have to frame, and in Yirtzeh Hashem in tomorrow's daf, we'll find resolution to all of these items. We'll say tremendous Yashar Koach, wishing everyone a wonderful day and a lichtige Chanukah.